Racist police officer kicks an elderly black blind man without knowing that his son is an FBI agent. There was an almost poetic calm to Maplewood's mornings. The sunlight trickled lazily down the facades of the old houses, and the sound of the local church bells mingled with the soft creaking of the trees, as if the whole city breathed in the rhythm of routine. It was in this serene setting that Samuel Washington, a 78-year-old black man who had been blind since he was 40, left home as he did every day, with a cane in one hand and a gray wool coat on his thin body bent by time. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every smell of the flower shops that preceded the square, every sound fold that announced the coffee shop on the corner. Even without seeing, he knew where he was by the sound of cars braking at the intersection, by the aroma of cornbread fresh from the oven in the bakery next door, by the sharp laugh of the laundry attendant. Everything was familiar. Everything was safe. He did not see faces, but he felt presences. And among the noises, there was one sound he especially loved: the wooden seat of the communal cafeteria, the bench on the corner where he sat to listen to the world. That morning, however, the world sounded different. The approaching footsteps were not those of young people going to school, nor of gentlemen walking their dogs. They were heavy, rigid steps of those who walk not by inertia, but by authority. The shadow came before the voice. He felt the change in the air, the subtle retreat of the people around. And then came the dry, bureaucratic, and impatient tone. "Sir, you cannot stand still here. It's getting in the way of customers getting in the way." Samuel turned his face in the direction of the sound. The voice was young, masculine, and had the rehearsed firmness of someone who had memorized his orders but never learned to listen. Samuel did not answer immediately. He knew that responding too quickly was seen as confrontation. But so was being too silent. He chose his words carefully. "I'm just resting a little, son. I always sit here every day." There was a pause. That short silence loaded with impatience, as if the next line was already being pushed down my throat. "Then you need to move. Now." Before Samuel could steady his feet and prop himself up properly to get up, he felt a hand firmly pushing on his side. It was a discreet gesture, as they do with those who know they will not be noticed or defended. Samuel stumbled, didn't fall, but his cane slipped out of his hand and fell to the ground with a dry sound that cut through the air like cracking glass. The policeman did not apologize. He just mumbled something like, "Take care," and kept walking. The cruelest thing about that morning was not the push. That was what did not happen after him. No one said a word. No one approached. People averted. Their eyes accelerated their steps. And there stood Samuel, with his left hand searching in the air for a cane that now seemed infinitely far away, and with his chest pressed by a sensation that was not new, but still ached as if it were. On the opposite sidewalk behind the window of a bookstore, a security camera recorded everything in silence, and behind the counter, an old bookseller frowned and pressed the recording remote control with trembling fingers. He knew that gentleman, and more than that, he knew who his son was, but neither Samuel nor the policeman knew yet. What had just happened at that small intersection in Maplewood was not just any push. It was the fuse of something much bigger. And what would come next would make not only the city rise, but so did the past. Because the truth, like time, always comes back. And what's to come, it will still give something to talk about. As the world outside kept turning, inside the small bookstore in front of the corner bench, time seemed to have stopped. The place smelled of old paper and warm coffee. Its shelves curved under the weight of forgotten stories, and the clock turned too slow for those who expected something to happen. Behind the counter, standing, was Harold Givens, a middle-aged bookseller with a white beard and eyes that had seen more than they wanted. But that morning, something made him go back in time. He had just checked the automatic recording of the external cameras, an old habit since the front window had been sprayed with graffiti by vandals years before. But that day, what he saw on the screen was not graffiti nor suspicious movement. It was silent violence. The video showed an elderly black man being pushed by a police officer on the sidewalk. The cane fell. The man hesitated. Nobody helped. Harold felt his chest tighten. He knew that face, even if it was aged, even if it was behind dark glasses. Samuel Washington, one of the most upstanding men who have ever walked those streets. A gentleman who used to read aloud to children in the church. But more than that, Harold knew Samuel's son, Marcus Washington. And just thinking about that name, a shiver ran down her spine. The son who disappeared after a scandal involving the FBI. The agent who refused to silence dangerous truths and, therefore, disappeared. To most people, Marcus was an urban legend, someone who fell from grace and faded into the shadows. But Harold knew better. Marcus had trusted him years ago. He had left a sealed envelope and a handwritten email number with a single instruction. If something ever happens to my father, send it to me. Only in this case. Harold didn't hesitate. He climbed the creaking stairs of the mezzanine, sat in front of the old computer, accessed the encrypted email he had never used, and attached the video. Not a word, just the file. He clicked send, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time felt afraid. Not from what I had seen, but what could happen now, because if Marcus Washington was still alive, and he was sure he was, that recording was more than a wake-up call. It was a call, and when men like Marcus are called upon, they answer. But Harold also knew that this return would not be like the others, because it was not just a wounded father or a son seeking justice. There were secrets buried with the last name Washington, things that the FBI wished would never be brought to light again. And now, someone had lit the match. The city did not know it yet, but it was about to burn. The rain started light, almost like a murmur over the rooftops of Maplewood, at the exact moment when a black sedan without a front license plate crossed the entrance gate of the city. No siren, no headlights on, no ads, just the continuous sound of tires on the damp asphalt and the wind pushing autumn leaves down the narrow road. The man behind the wheel wore no badge or badge. His eyes were protected by sunglasses, even with cloudy skies. But anyone who saw it up close would notice something colder than the storm. Intention. Marcus Washington had returned. After 8 years away, after disappearing under a cloud of internal accusations and strategic silences, he returned to where it all began. But not like before, not as the exemplary agent decorated in 3 states. Not like the prodigy boy at the academy who everyone said would be director one day. He came back as a man who knew too much. The email arrived in the early hours of the morning with the video. No text, no sender. But he didn't need context. It was enough to see the image of his father stumbling, the cane falling to the ground, and the silence around, so that all the blood in his body would reorganize itself in a single direction. Action. He did not announce his arrival. No phone call, no reunion. He went straight through avenues he knew by heart, turned around the same corners he walked when he still wore a navy blue public school uniform. But now it was another time. Another Marcus. The car stopped 2 blocks from Samuel's house. He started the engine for a few minutes in silence, watching. The old gate still creaked. The balcony still had the same wooden swing. And behind the lacy curtain of the window he saw a well-known silhouette motionless with its head bowed. His father did not see him, but I knew he was there. Marcus didn't knock on the door. Not that day. He had something more urgent to do. It was not the time for hugs or promises. It was time to understand, to follow tracks. On the same day, he went to the coffee shop around the corner. He ordered a coffee and sat down at the last table, facing the bench where his father had been. Pushed. Noted. He counted the steps of the policeman who passed by the sidewalk. He measured the time between one patrol and another. Then he walked along the sides of the block, entered alleys that no one else used, recorded signs, recorded conversations. He did what he had learned to do as a special agent: collect evidence, before anyone knew a case was open. That night, back in the car, Marcus opened an old laptop, turned on his own router, and accessed a server with credentials that were still valid. The FBI hadn't deactivated his authorizations, perhaps out of fear of what he might do if he were officially erased. And there it was, the name of the policeman who pushed Samuel, recruited 5 years ago. Clean paper history. But Marcus knew where to look. In 27 minutes, he cross-referenced internal files, police station cameras, and chat groups between officers. What he found was not only contempt, it was standard. That policeman had done that before, thrice. With the elderly, with homeless people, with veterans, and always with the same institutional answer: welfare check. Marcus calmly closed his laptop. He didn't say anything, but inside him, the old agent was already active, because the city thought it knew Samuel. Washington. I thought he was just another old man with poor hearing and slow steps. But they forgot one thing. Some men walk slowly not out of weakness, but because they learned to measure the world before reacting. And now Maplewood's world was being measured with surgical precision. The city was still sleeping, but Marcus had already woken up. And when men like him move, silence is never the same again. The cold arrived earlier that week in Maplewood. It was the kind of wind that made the windows shake before the sun rose. But inside a small rented room on the second floor of a motel on the edge of town, the air was different. Silent, tense, full of data. Marcus Washington sat in front of a wall covered in post-it notes, city maps, patrol hours, and printouts of archived conversations from police groups, all connected with red wires, as he did when he put together psychological profiles of federal criminals. Only now the target was closer, more personal. Bradley Grant, 32, municipal police officer. Official history, clean. Real history, spots hidden under layers of conveniently filed paperwork. 3 internal complaints of excessive use of force, all closed with the same note: not sufficient evidence. Marcus knew what that meant. He has also signed this type of paper. But now it was different. Now he was on the other side. On his laptop, he entered a code he hadn't used in 6 years. It was a key to access the Delta Nexus, a parallel database created by renegade agents within the FBI to protect sensitive files from manipulation. Almost no one knew about the existence of this, but Marcus was almost nobody. By entering Bradley's name, he cross-referenced data with records from neighboring cities. What he discovered made his heart slow down, a clear sign that the instinct had been confirmed. The same officer had been secretly reprimanded for aggressive behavior when he was a cadet in another county. What's more, he was part of an informal preventive actions group that monitored citizens deemed potentially destabilizing. An internal code for blacks, immigrants, ex-convicts, and people with disabilities. Among the names listed as risk profiles was Samuel Washington, noted as stubborn old man who occupies public spaces, possible figure of local instability. Marcus froze. His hands did not tremble, but his eyes hardened. That was more than abuse, it was politics, it was surveillance disguised as a patrol. Maplewood was being mapped not for safety, but by control, and he knew where it ended. He got up, picked up the encrypted phone, and called an old number. A woman answered, cold, direct voice. If you're calling Marcus, it means that he has returned. He did not immediately respond. I need access to the files of the ARC-17 operation, and I want the internal recordings of the Maplewood police station in the last 60 days. There was silence. Are you really willing to reopen this hole? Someone messed with my father. The line was muted. Then the answer, you'll have what you need in 12 hours. But no, if you pull this thread, whatever comes will not go back into the ball. He hung up, because it was no longer a question of pulling the thread. The ball had already caught fire. The next morning, Marcus received an email with a private link. When he opened it, he saw the internal images of the police station. Officer Bradley laughing, throwing Samuel's broken cane into the trash can as if discarding a garbage bag. In the background, another policeman says, "This old man thinks he owns the sidewalk." Bradley replies, "Yes. And now he's walking without GPS." They laughed. Marcus did not. He copied the video, saved it in 3 different places, and sent one of them to a trusted contact in the independent media. The city was still asleep, but the system began to tremble, because now Marcus Washington was not just a former agent. He was a walking dossier with a personal motive, and the last time he had a reason, agents disappeared and bosses fell. The kitchen radio tuned low, as usual, to an AM station that played old-fashioned jazz between one bulletin and another. The kettle beeped on the stove, and the smell of hibiscus tea mingled with the sound of crickets outside. Inside the house, with yellowed walls and faded portraits, Samuel Washington sat at the table with his spine erect, his hands steady, but his heart carrying more than it would ever let on. The new cane, which Marcus had left him the night before, was resting next to the door. He didn't touch her yet, not out of contempt, but because he needed to do it for himself. The marks of the fall were still there, the pains too, but what hurt more, it was the silence that came later. The people who saw it but turned it away, those who listened but said nothing, the cop who pushed him without a second thought, and worse, without regret. And yet that morning, Samuel put on his navy blue cotton shirt, buttoning each button, as gently as he buttoned hope, even though it had already been frayed by decades of invisibility. Next to the radio, the landline phone rang. It was the local community radio host, Tia Rosaine, a longtime friend, who made a point of calling every Monday to ask how he was doing. But this time, Samuel answered differently. "Rosaine," he said in a deep, firm voice, "do you still accept visits on the morning show?" On the other side, she hesitated. I knew who he was, he knew what had happened, but he never imagined hearing that question. "For you, Samuel. The microphone is yours." The next morning, the radio studio was quieter than usual. Rosaine warned that she would have a special guest for a chat. It was not a protest. It was not a complaint. It was just a man telling what he felt. Samuel arrived with the help of a neighbor, refusing help to climb the 3 steps of the entrance. When he sat in front of the microphone, the technician adjusted the headphones. But he didn't need to listen. I just needed to speak, and he did. Not anger, but of absence. He told how he felt when he was pushed by someone who never looked at him, what it was like to hear his cane hit the ground and realize that no one moved. As blindness was not the problem was being treated as if he didn't exist. For 12 minutes he spoke, without a single cry, without a single tear, with the composure of someone who had already faced greater things, but refused to accept this as one more. When the broadcast ended, the radio phone did not stop ringing. People wanted to talk, apologize, to tell that they have also felt invisible. Some were crying. Others wanted to know how they could help. Someone shared the excerpt from the interview in a home video on social media, and in a few hours the video passed 1,000 views, then 10,000, then 100,000. Samuel never asked to be a symbol of anything, but on that day, in that speech, he became. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Marcus was watching the video on his cell phone. In silence, he pressed the pause button just as his father was saying, "The worst violence is not physical. It's the one that convinces you that you've never been here." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just whispered to himself, "They messed with the wrong man, and they haven't even realized it yet." Night descended heavy on Maplewood like a thick curtain. The yellowish lights of the streetlights flickered in the wind, and the city seemed, more than ever, to ignore what was brewing in its own belly. But in the cramped room of Motel 6B, the truth began to pulse like a broken code. Marcus was in front of 2 monitors, one with the images of the police station, the other with a black screen, where command lines ran fast, invading obscure directories. He was no longer an authorized agent. But the old shortcuts still worked. Because the system has never known how to protect itself from its own ghosts. The name Bradley Grant was in the center of the screen. But what Marcus was looking for was not obvious. He wanted what the records hid, not what they showed. And after more than an hour of cross-referencing reports, internal cameras, data from the federal system, and encrypted fragments of old investigations, he found it. A name, a code, a file hidden on a sealed server with the identification of Dark Memory, ARC-17. He hesitated. ARC-17 was the name of the operation that had led Marcus to his downfall within the FBI. A mission involving internal espionage and manipulation of police data in small towns in the South. Marcus tried to report it, but was silenced. Accused of insubordination. Forced to sign a confidentiality agreement under threat of arrest. That's when he disappeared. Hitherto. But what he didn't know until that moment is that one of those involved in the original operation was Bradley Grant himself. At the time, just a cybersecurity recruit, Bradley had been a technical intern at ARC-17, allocated to assist in filtering social risk profiles based on racial and demographic patterns. He was not just an ordinary policeman. It was a direct product of the same structure that destroyed Marcus. More than an abuser, he was the living legacy of the corrupt system. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind boiling. That was no coincidence. That was continuity. His gaze returned to the screen. A second video was attached to the file, recorded with an internal webcam of a secret training session for agents. In it, an improvised classroom, several young recruits. In the center, a smiling instructor with an enthusiastic voice said, "You are not here to wait for danger. You're here to predict who's going to be the problem before it happens." And then he points to a projection with random images. A young black man in a hood, a Muslim woman, a blind man with his cane raised as if lost. He was Marcus's father, used as an example of a non-collaborative profile during approach simulations. The camera shakes slightly, and in the second row, writing everything down with an almost ironic smile, is Bradley Grant. Marcus closed the video with a dry snap. It was not just an isolated act. It was doctrine. It was protocol. The police officer who pushed his father learned to see him as a threat before he even met him. He took the video, extracted the audio, and added subtitles. Climbed on a secure server. But this time, he didn't send it to the newspapers. He sent it to the National Civil Rights Congress with a simple note. The doctrine is alive, and it has names. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Samuel was sleeping, soundly for the first time in days. But Marcus didn't. Because that morning he understood his fight was never against a police officer. He was against a system that taught men to fear the blind and revere uniforms. And now, this system had a face, he had a voice, he had proof, and it was about to be torn apart in public. The sun rose in Maplewood like any other day, but the city woke up differently. On social networks, the name Samuel Washington was among the most mentioned. The video of the radio interview, mixed with new material sent to Congress, where his face was shown as a risk profile in a real training program, had spread like wildfire through dry grass. The whole country watched, appalled, as a blind elderly man was shown as an example of a threat in a system that claimed to be protective. The city that had once ignored Samuel could now not look away. And what began with murmurs became a chorus. Signs began to appear in the windows. "I walk with Samuel." Small businesses pasted black ribbons on the doors as a sign of protest. In the central square, someone wrote with chalk on the floor, "If being blind makes you a target, then the system needs goggles, not guns." Bradley Grant, the police officer, tried to hide behind official notes. The police station released a statement alleging distortions of the context and that the images were being analyzed. But it was too late, because the city had already decided that the truth did not need a caption. Independent newspapers investigated and found 3 more shelved complaints. all with a similar pattern: black, elderly, or disabled men being treated with neglect or disproportionate force. No one had listened to them, hitherto. Meanwhile, Marcus moved with precision. With the data he gathered, he created a digital dossier that mapped the progression of abuse, with dates, records, videos, and above all, the names of superiors who silenced the complaints. He made no speeches. He did not stand on podiums. It just sent the dossier into the right hands. First, to an award-winning journalist with contacts at the New York Times. Then, to a former federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights. Finally, to a retired judge, a survivor of the same system, who now led a national restorative justice NGO. That same evening, an open letter was published in the local newspapers and read aloud in front of the police station by a young activist. This is no longer an isolated case. This is the portrait of a structure that decides who has the right to exist in peace, and if the system is blind, so let him learn to listen. The mayor, under pressure, scheduled an extraordinary public hearing. The Maplewood Police Department was officially notified. There would be an outside investigation. Bradley Grant was temporarily removed, but the damage was already done. In the corridors, the whispers turned to silence. In the offices, doors began to close from the inside. And on a cold night, in front of the bench where it all began, Samuel sat down again, no longer alone. Around him, chairs were arranged in a circle. Children sat at their feet. Young people held signs. Adults listened in silence. He did not make a speech. He just held his cane and said, "My name is Samuel, and I don't disappear easily." The crowd stood up. There was no shouting, no applause, just the sound of steady feet stepping on the ground. Together, there, before any formal hearing, the trial had already begun. And the system. I was already shaking. Maplewood's town hall building was modest, with faded beige walls and an antique coat of arms carved over the front door. The room where the hearing was to be held was nothing more than an adapted lecture, with long formica tables and chairs padded with worn upholstery. But that morning, she carried a historical weight that not even the largest court in the capital could contain. Marcus arrived early. He no longer wore dark clothing or surveillance tactics. Now he was in a simple jacket and bare-eyed, like a man who no longer needed to hide from the truth. He carried only a thin briefcase with ordered documents, a recording on his cell phone, and a handwritten letter by his father. In the front row, Samuel was seated among neighbors, young activists, pastors, and even a group of students from the local school. His new cane rested on his lap, polished, firm, and with the initials SW engraved in silver. It was as if he carried everything he lost there, and everything he recovered. On the other side, the review bench, a guest state judge, civil rights representatives, an observer attorney for the Department of Justice, and in the center, the empty seat of the removed police officer, Bradley Grant, who refused to attend. The hearing began with the reading of the facts. In silence, everyone listened to the audio of the video where the cane was thrown in the trash with laughter. They heard the instructor of the ARC-17 operation describing how to identify walking threats. They watched the recording of the police officer justifying the push as an act of prevention. And then it was Marcus's turn. He got up unhurriedly, put his cell phone on the table and pressed play. It was Samuel's voice, recorded the night before. "I don't want revenge. I want the next person who walks like me, with slower steps, with less vision. You don't need a son who is a former federal agent for your dignity to be respected." The room fell silent. But it was a different silence. Not the silence of fear. It was the silence of recognition. The judge suspended the session for the reading of the final opinion. And when he returned, he did not announce sentences. He announced guidelines. Bradley Grant would answer for misconduct and abuse of authority. But more than that, a permanent community review committee on police conduct would be established, and by direct proposal of the judge, the Washington Code would be created, a new state protocol for approach, training, and accountability, inspired by Samuel's experience. The room rose, not to applaud, but because they knew that something had changed there. Outside, the city waited, and as Samuel stepped out of the building, Marcus beside him holding his cane like a symbolic scepter, the wind blew through the trees of the square, and the church bells rang softly, as if time was finally bowing to what was fair. James, the guy from the coffee shop, walked up to Samuel and handed him a cup with a ribbon bow. On the side, handwritten, a phrase, "This bank now has an owner, and it's no longer silence." Samuel smiled, leaned his fingers on the hot rim of the glass, and said only, "Now, I can sit in peace." Marcus didn't answer. He just noted, because he knew that was not the end, but it was a new beginning, one where his father, and so many others invisible, would not have to scream to exist. And at that moment, the corner bench was no longer just wood. It was altar. It was a frame. It was a living memory that dignity cannot be pushed. She always comes back. In a world where so many voices are silenced before they are even heard, Samuel reminds us that dignity does not depend on open eyes, but of a soul that never closes. He didn't have to raise his voice. It was enough to keep walking, because sometimes the revolution does not come with shouts or flags. She arrives with firm steps, with a cane hitting the ground, with a son who refuses to lower his head, and with a city that finally learns to listen to what has always been there. May this history not only be remembered, but repeated, in actions, in changes, on you. If this story gave you goosebumps, share it with someone who should never be pushed to the sidelines. Mark in the comments who you know who carries courage in silence, and write a word, visible, because that's what everyone deserves to be. And never forget, as long as there is someone walking with dignity, the system is still to be repaired. But for that, someone needs to keep walking. Maybe that someone is you.